Hello and welcome to BharatShakti.in. We are going to be talking about Sri Lanka and we'll go a couple of decades back to the Indian peacekeeping forces involvement in Sri Lanka. This is the 35th year of the Indian peacekeeping forces intervention in Sri Lanka. The intervention was made possible after an agreement was signed between the Sri Lankans and the Indians for getting Indian forces onto the island. Uh, this year also is the second anniversary when veterans of Sri Lanka and also other soldiers and civilians, perhaps along with them, will pay their homage to those 1,274 braves that we lost in Sri Lanka. Well, that's a big body count for any country. To take you through the paces, and we'll restrict ourselves only to the major issues. To tell you the Sri Lankan stories, I have three officers with me. All three of them have served in Sri Lanka. The first, Colonel Rakesh Sidhu Senamela.
Good evening, Brigadier Chatterjee.
Well, Colonel Sidhu, as much as I'm aware, when you fought in, the entire Sri Lankan island as such in all sectors of the island, and you were with your battalion 15 Mech Infantry, and later on you went on to command 12 Mech Infantry. Well, he's also been played a major role in terms of recalling the memories of people who died over there, people who were maimed over there, all the battles that we fought over there. Welcome to BharatShakti.in.
Thank you, Brigadier Chatterjee, and good evening to the audience.
The other guest that I have with me is Lieutenant Colonel Atul Kochar. He's operated in Trincomalee and Batticaloa as a young subaltern in Sri Lanka. He's also written a book on Sri Lanka as a co-author with Colonel Nair, another friend of mine. And he's also very deeply into the affairs of the veterans of Sri Lanka. Welcome.
Good evening, sir. Thank you so much for providing this wonderful platform. Good evening to all the audience.
The last guest that I would like to introduce,
Colonel K. Chandan.
Colonel Chandan is from the Armored Corps 65 Armored Regiment, to be precise. He took premature retirement later, but before that he served in Sri Lanka. And what is surprising about his career profile is the number of tenures that he's had in insurgency-prone areas. Welcome to Bharat Shakti.
Good evening, Brigadier Chatterjee, and hello to all the viewers.
Right. I think we'll start off with the issues that I have for discussion with you, gentlemen, if you're ready. And my first question is really to Colonel Atul Kochar. Colonel Kochar, if you can tell us about the genesis of the festering dispute between the Sri Lankan Tamils and the Sinhalas in Sri Lanka till the accord was signed in 1987.
Firstly, it should be understood that Sri Lanka was a Sinhalese majority state, and it got its independence around the same time which India got. And it was also the headquarters of the Southeast Asian Command, that is during the Second World War. And as far as the Tamils were concerned, they were in a minority. There are two kinds of Tamils. One is plantation workers. They were the Indian migrated ones, and the indigenous Tamils, who considered them of a higher caste. In fact, even the elites of Sinhalese polity once upon a time comprised of these Tamils. And in the early part, the Tamils had established a good name for themselves. Now, later, with the birth of the Sri Lanka, nationalism issues set in, and as usual, the minorities were weighed down upon. The three main issues the Tamils had. One was about the language. It was removed as another alternative official language to the Sinhalese language. The other was jobs. Jobs also, they were deprived of jobs. And third was reservation in education. And lastly, perhaps the last straw was the disenfranchisement, that is, not being able to exercise their franchise. These were the most positive factors giving rise to Tamil nationalism. To top it, with these aggravating factors, there was an emergent demand of home run by the Liberation Tamil Tigers Elam. which after a tussle emerged as a majority and a totalitarian militant group. It eliminated most of the other leadership, and Prabhakaran, as is well known, would brook no opposition. Also, along with this, was the rise of Buddhist nationalism. Sri Lanka was facing internal turmoil with the Jan Vimukta Perumana, that is the local Sinhalese militant phase emerging against both the government and also against the Tamils. So the stage was now set for a showdown. Riots and pogroms became common, and the demand for the homeland grew, and so also some support from Tamil Nadu was there because they had a lot of stake with the large number of Tamils who were in Sri Lanka. And finally, Op Vardamajari took place, in which the Sri Lankan army had pushed the LTT into a corner in Jaffna. But by that time, India had decided to intervene, and it launched Operation Puna Malai, where it dropped about 23 tons of supplies in a bid to send a signal to the Sri Lankan government that they would not tolerate further persecution or militant action against the LTT. The stage was set, and on 29 July 1987, the Indo-Sri Lankan Accord was signed between Jayawardene and Mr. Rajiv Gandhi, the then Prime Minister of India. So this is in brief the genesis of the problem.
Right. Thank you, Colonel Kochir. I think that's very precisely given to us. Thank you. Covered, I think, most of the major issues very clearly. My next question is to Colonel Sidhu. If you can go into the key aspects of the Indo-Sri Lankan Accord and what were the limitations leading to an IPKF intervention ultimately.
Okay. So, on 29th of July this year, we'll be completing 35 years of the signing of the Indo-Sri Lanka Accord. And the first facet of the accord which I would like to put across is the visuals that when our then Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi was reviewing the Guard of Honor, he was rifle butted by one of the Sri Lankan soldiers who were presenting the Guard of Honor. That was a clear-cut indication that the accord did not find much favor with the common citizens of Sri Lanka at large. But when we look at the critical review of the Sri Lankan Accord, we'll find that it was very much in favor of the Sri Lankan state also, as it was for the Tamil minority as well as the Indian state. There are three major strands around which this accord is woven. The first is that the acceptance of the unity, the sovereignty, and the territorial integrity of Sri Lanka was paramount and was accepted by all the parties who signed the accord and were also to actively participate in its implementation. But simultaneously, along with this, the Sri Lankan government was also required to undertake certain constitutional measures to ameliorate the conditions of the Tamils within Sri Lanka, and also to cease military operations in the northern and eastern provinces of Sri Lanka. The second strand was that it legitimized the grievances of the Tamils, which were facing more or less state-sponsored persecution. Along with this, the Tamil militants were also required to surrender their arms to the Sri Lankan government as per the terms and conditions of the accord. And the third strand was the acceptance of India's role as a guarantor, to the extent that the Indian government was also authorized to use force to implement this accord in case any of these sites running from it. Here it is interesting that India decided to become a guarantor of the Tamil militants who were not under its sovereign jurisdiction. So this is a very interesting facet of this accord. Now, having talked about this, there are two major parts of this accord. One is dealing with the political provisions, and the other is with the military provisions of the accord. And the third aspect, which I'll be touching upon subsequently, is the very strict timelines which were mentioned in this accord. The interim merger of the northern and the eastern provinces of Sri Lanka was to take place within 3 months of the signing of the accord, followed by elections to the provincial councils of northern and eastern Sri Lanka provinces by December 87. The second was the approval of this merger or non-approval through a referendum, which was to be accomplished by December 1988. The third was that a general amnesty was to be granted to all the political and the military prisoners which were which were held by the Sri Lankan government. And of course, India was required in conjunction with Sri Lanka to expedite the return of the Indian citizens, that is the plantation Tamils from Sri Lanka to India, and simultaneously the Sri Lankan government was to expedite return of the refugees of the Tamil refugees who had shifted to Jaffna because of the crisis. And the last part was that the Tamil language was to be accorded the same national status of official language as was the Sinhala. The military provisions of the accord were also very, very clear. Hostilities were to cease within 48 hours of the signing of the accord. The arms surrender was to commence within 72 hours after cessation of the hostilities, which is 48 hours plus 72 hours. The Sri Lankan army in the northern and eastern provinces was to confine itself to the barracks and not undertake any military operations. And the Sri Lankan president was authorized to invite the Indian peacekeeping force for enforcement of the accord and using force if needed. So these were broadly the political and the military provisions of this accord. Now coming to the timeline, you see the accord specified that it was to come into effect immediately on signing of the agreement, which is 29th of July 1987. Very interestingly, the Sri Lankan president also signed the order inviting the Indian peacekeeping force into Sri Lanka on the same day. And even more interesting is that the Indian army commenced the induction of the Indian peacekeeping force into Sri Lanka also on this night of 29 July 1987 itself. So this is the speed as far as the implementation of the accord was concerned. The other timelines, which were also in a very swift time frame, cessation of hostilities within 48 hours, surrender of arms and ammunition by the Tamil militants within 72 hours of cessation of hostilities, the merger of the northern and the eastern provinces within 3 months of the signing of the accord, the holding of the general elections in 87, and finalizing the official merger by December 88. This all implied that there was a lack of trust between the Tamil citizens of Sri Lanka and between the Sri Lankan government. The accord itself was under progress for almost a year. For the last 6 to 9 months, there was hardly any progress in the finalization of the agreement till undertaking the operation Pulamalai, as has been brought out by Colonel Atul, he speeded up the process and the accord got signed almost in a very fast time frame.
Okay.
Now, coming to the aspect of these impact on the accord and how it comes about, is that the Sri Lankan government and the Liberation Tiger of Tamil Elams, which was the major LTT, major Tamil militant group, they were not keen on signing of the accord. They were pushed into the signing of the accord by the Indian government, and it talks about the lien which the Indian government had within Sri Lanka with their government as well as with the Tamil citizens. The second aspect, which is there, is that India became a guarantor of this accord, but neither the Tamil militants were subject to its sovereign jurisdiction. So I wonder how it would have ensured
Okay. I got it.
acquiescence to the court. And the last part, which is of importance, is that the accord mentions very clearly that if needed, the force will be employed in the Indian
Okay.
peacekeeping force. So I am surprised that neither the Indian government nor the Indian military had prepared for this contingency,
Okay.
and this is what impacted the conduct of the military operations as and when
Right.
the requirement came to commence them.
Right. Thank you, Colonel Sidhu. Thank you. But gentlemen, I'll have to just remind you once, we'll have to go a little faster. We'll have to go a little faster, otherwise we'll go beyond the timings, really. Okay. My next question to Colonel Channan. Colonel Channan, what are the major Indian strategic interests that you would like to define, and the risks that we faced in Sri Lanka, that our interests faced in Sri Lanka? And if you can just keep yourself very concise.
I think there were three major considerations that India had in mind when we decided to intervene into Sri Lanka. One is the strategic location of the island itself and its close proximity to the Indian coastline. Between coast to coast, it's approximately 28 kilometers, 15 to 20-minute boat ride on a high-speed boat. So the considerations were that we didn't firstly want a foreign entity inimical to the Indian interest to come and intervene and start assisting the Sri Lankan government. Second was that we didn't want the outflow of the independence movement to the Tamil Nadu state, where it could create a problem for the Indian government. And lastly, it was also in our interest that the integrity of Sri Lanka should be maintained and peace should prevail in the northern and eastern provinces.
Right. Thank you, Colonel Chandan. We'll get back to you, Colonel Sidhu. How would you rate the preparation of Indian forces? You switched over from peacekeeping to peace enforcement. How would you rate the preparations for that, Colonel Sidhu?
Yes, para 6 of the annexure of the accord very clearly specifies that the IPKF will enforce cessation of hostilities if needed. But the Indian Army, as I have already explained previously, because of the swift timelines, Indian Army was prepared for a conventional military intervention, and the Indian peacekeeping force required additional preparations or preparations anew, which the time was not there for executing them. The formations and the units which were moved along with the Indian peacekeeping force, they had all along been trained for conventional operations and not for undertaking anti-militancy or peacekeeping operations. So along with this, there was a lack of military maps as and when the Indian peacekeeping force moved into Sri Lanka, into its mandated areas. The troops were confined to the barracks, and it was only the staff officers and the formation commanders, who were moving around. So even the ground recce had not been conducted. So when the operations commenced in the month of October, with the lack of maps, lack of intelligence also, because the intelligence organization was not fully functional, along with the Indian peacekeeping force, which at that time was primarily 54 Infantry Division. These did hamper the conduct of military operations by the Indian peacekeeping force in the initial stages in October. And another key aspect which I wish to highlight is that there seems to be a dichotomy in what the Indian government wished to execute with the implementation of this accord. The contingency of the LTTE reneging from the accord was not considered, or if it was considered, it was not considered as a major factor because the Indian military contingent was not apprised to be ready for this option. As a result, when the operations commenced in October because of intransigence by the LTTE, it was a complete surprise. And the way the Indian army and the ethos of the Indian soldiers is, it is very difficult to overnight switch over from looking at the Tamils as the downtrodden, as the enemies against whom action is to be executed. I
Right.
feel this was one of the major reasons.
Okay. If we can get on to the next question, I have it for Colonel Kocher for you. What are the legacy issues which need to be addressed in respect of the Indian peacekeeping forces?
Well, as far as this campaign operation is concerned, it is a case of lost and never found, if you ask me. It's very simple. It was the first out of country operation overseas by Indian force under a national mandate. And we were fighting one of the best guerrilla forces, which is well known. It's not I am saying that. Secondly, this operation was a testing ground for both the B-25 also and the IL-76. It was also unique in many respects. If you ask any officer the toughest operation, he'll tell you of Pawan, and General Atta said so in the last week's YouTube. We had a separate section on that. He has also stated as the toughest operation he's come across with a lot of ambiguity. You didn't know whether the LTT will have you or the Sri Lankan army guy will have you. So it's a very ambiguous situation with a very undefined military. And so we are asking for a separate exclusive commemoration at par with 71 war and Kargil. That's a very reasonable demand to my mind. Now, as far as the Battle Honor Awards are concerned, we got one PVC and 6 MVC totally apart from a host of other awards. And between 11 October and 26 October, we sustained 25% of the casualties, that is 300 of the total casualties sustained over the approximately 3-year period. We got sustained 33% of the total wounded, that is about 1,000 within this 2 weeks period. So that nobody should have a doubt. It was a fighting in built-up area, very intense fighting in which armored MAC and infantry were in a pitched battle with LTT. So that Battle Honor Awards is another thing we are asking for recognition. It's never too late. My unit is pursuing a case in 71, and so is a cavalry unit of 71 war, which Colonel Chanan mentioned the other day. Next is we want an updated record of kill in actions on websites available publicly. There is very sketchy information and mismatch. The Pawan figure at the National War Memorial says something like 1171 killed. And I believe the Sri Lankan, that is at the Colombo Memorial, which was made before our own memorial, it was made in 2009, that has a different figure. These ambiguities have to be resolved and they have to have the KIA on a proper platform. Then declassification of Pawan, it's now time to put to rest speculations and versions. Secondly, if you go to the National War Memorial, there's just an indicator, a totem indicator that of Pawan. There's no write-up about of Pawan. Large number of unmarked graves have been seen, which are in a state of disrepair. Our own VIP and officers have gone there, but I don't know whether they've done. And a large number of people do wreath laying in Colombo, but when it comes to doing a wreath laying in an organized manner, I don't know why we are shy of doing it in India. So these are the legacy issues in brief. There are a number of other issues, but I just put you the crunch points.
Well, my last question, and this goes to Colonel Chanan for you. You see, Sri Lanka is going through difficult times today. It may not be really a problem like an insurgency, etc. It's more an economic problem. But however, they're going through a very difficult time, and we've been all partners with them. We would like to strengthen our friendship further, perhaps. Have we done enough for them in today's context?
I think that the Indian government has been proactive under the current circumstances, that it has already provided an aid of about close to $4 billion, and is in the recent past there was supposed to be an all-party meeting in which the government of India was to take a decision on what aid would be recommended for Sri Lanka. As we all know, the problem was created by the Chinese, who sort of lured them into taking on huge infrastructure development on loan basis, due to which the economy failed. Now that had been a little setback for the Indian government because we had lost our space to the Chinese. But having had this unfortunate implosion of Sri Lanka due to its economic conditions, I think it's a good time for the Indian government to take on humanitarian aid and disaster relief measures. And the newspaper reports suggest that some Tamil political parties are on their own engaging with the Tamils of the northern and the eastern provinces, which to my mind is a little immature approach at the state level, because this has to be a country response, and we should be looking at Sri Lanka holistically with all its groups intact to make sure that the country is back on its feet. The other possible way they can probably help themselves is that in the past, when the LTTE was fighting against the Sri Lankan government, a host of Sri Lankan non-resident people from Europe were sustaining the entire campaign. Now, I think it's a time for reconciliation for the Sri Lankans, that they must add in and support their own government by sending in aid and payments back to the country. That is my humble view.
Right. Thank you so much, gentlemen. I must thank all of you for having spared your time and been with us on Bharat Shakti. Thank you, Colonel Sidhu. Thank you, Colonel Kocher. And thank you, Colonel Channel.
So, before we close off, may I take 15 seconds to specify a point, which is that other than the general feeling which is there in the environment propagated by irresponsible people, that the IPKF mission was a failure, it is not so. The GOC IPKF Lieutenant General A.S. Kalkat is very clear that on 10th December 1988, he had signaled to the Indian government, mission accomplished, awaiting further orders. Thank you.
Right. Thank you. And thank you, viewers. Thanks for logging on to bharatshakti.in. Do go to our YouTube channel and do go to our social media pages and like us, support us, and also let us know what kind of programs you would like to watch. Thank you.